Washington, D.C., National Archives Research Wing. Present day, early winter. The National Archives felt more like a mausoleum than a research center. Pale light bled from fluorescent panels high above, falling in narrow bands across concrete floors and endless shelving. Dust hung in the air like soft static. In the silence, every breath felt out of place. Cole Sutter had been coming to this room for over 20 years. He knew its layout better than he knew his own apartment. This morning he was buried in microfilm reels, Navy dispatches, orders, coded intercept logs, a quiet ritual before every publication. But today something shifted. The patrol orders for the USS Ward were altered, only slightly. A change in the grid, a small redirection of patrol area, but enough to raise alarms in the mind of someone who had memorized these coordinates long ago. Then came the deeper absence, a memo, Dutch in origin, recorded in the U.S. Pacific desk logs had vanished entirely. No deletion, no redaction, simply gone. Cole checked the file's metadata. The version had been digitized 3 weeks prior, officially verified, fully authenticated. Yet the document he remembered citing, teaching, and defending in lectures was no longer part of the historical record. He leaned back in his chair, the ghost of his father flickering at the edge of memory, an intelligence officer who had once told him, "The more you stare at a clean story, the more likely someone's wiped the blood off." Outside, rain whispered against the windows. Inside, the past no longer felt anchored. NOAA Remote Research Outpost, Oahu, Hawaii. Present day, sunset. From the edge of the NOAA facility in Honolulu, the sky always seemed vast and knowing. Layla Hara had worked enough night shifts to see every shade of Pacific weather, but none of it explained what had appeared again on her instruments. A pulse, high frequency, electromagnetic, centered above Pearl Harbor. Not a storm, not a satellite glitch. It registered just outside the bounds of natural resonance. This wasn't an isolated incident. The same pulse had repeated with precise timing. The pattern traced backward for decades, each occurrence faint but consistent. It behaved like a signature, something repeating through time with purpose. The strongest pulse occurred at 7:40 a.m., December 7, 1941. A ghost in the sky. Layla had grown up under the shadow of that date. Her father had been a military historian at the University of Hawaii. He'd spoken often of anomalies in the archival record, oddities dismissed by his peers, timelines that didn't quite line up. On his shelf had sat a binder. On the spine, Sutter Cole, Pearl Harbor discrepancies. Layla hadn't thought about that name in years. Now she found it again. An academic's profile, a recent publication, a keynote lecture describing non-random distortions in historical documentation, and the possibility that someone, somewhere, might be exerting subtle force across time. She reached for her keyboard and composed a message, short, direct. The wind shifted outside the dome as she hit send. NOAA Storm Control Wing, Honolulu. 2 days later. The NOAA Storm Control Wing was quiet when Cole arrived. The building had the stillness of a place always watching, always listening. Its sensors reached deep into the sky, but what they captured now had little to do with weather. Leela met him at the central console. No introductions were needed. Each already carried an intuition about the other, that neither was there by coincidence. On the main screen, a topographic map of Oahu pulsed with slow, expanding rings, data visualizations of the pulse events. At their center always was Pearl Harbor. Each ring came with a date, a pattern, a progression. December 7, 1941, December 6, 1961, December 5, 2001, December 7, 2049. Each aligned with known or long-suspected disruptions in the archival record. Beneath the console, Cole retrieved a printed document, an abandoned DARPA proposal, a rejected theory, Project Whisper. At its heart, a warning. That time might be vulnerable not to conquest, but to influence. That atmospheric resonance could serve as a bridge for subtle manipulation. That memory itself might one day falter under sustained pressure. The author, Julianne Holland. Outside, waves rolled in slow, deliberate sequence onto the southern shore. Inside, the past was no longer silent. Buried in the last page of the Whisper file was a personnel tag and mailing trace, a P.O. box in rural Oregon, decommissioned after 2005. Cole had cross-referenced it with an archived NSF grant trail. The match was unlikely, but not impossible. In a world where history could be rewritten, even ghosts left footprints. Remote forest perimeter, outside Silverton, Oregon. Present day, 1 week later. The road narrowed with every mile. Tall pines closed in from both sides, their bark slick with recent rain. Fog laced the canopy, softening the shapes of trees, telephone poles, the path itself. The vehicle moved slowly over the gravel, tires cracking frost, headlights cutting a path into silence. In the passenger seat, Layla Hara stared out into the mist. She had said little since leaving Portland. Her tablet dark in her lap, its charge long gone. She hadn't slept. Neither had Cole. The coordinates they followed weren't exact. Fragments of a personnel tag, an NSF grant log, and a long-dead P.O. box, but the feeling in her chest had grown heavier the closer they came. The cabin appeared suddenly, its silhouette half swallowed by the trees, shingled in aged cedar, patched roof, rusted fixtures. A crooked satellite dish jutted from one corner, blind and brittle. Stacks of firewood leaned precariously under plastic sheeting. Coaxial cables snaked up the walls like roots in reverse. Cole cut the engine. The silence that followed was total. Layla exhaled once, then opened her door. They approached slowly. No fence, no lights, just a single window faintly aglow. At the threshold, the door opened. Julianne Holland stood behind it, hand on the frame. Her face was older than the last known image, hair silver, eyes sharp. She studied them, not with surprise, but with the careful, trained stillness of someone who had long expected a knock, yet wasn't certain which version of reality would bring it. Recognition flickered in her expression. First at Cole, then Layla. She didn't invite them in, she stepped aside without a word. Inside, the cabin was warmer than it appeared. Not cozy, functional. Papers and analog instruments filled every surface. A shortwave receiver hummed in one corner. Hand-pinned maps and printouts layered the walls like scale armor. And at the center of the table, untouched and pulsing, Module X. It was compact, smooth, matte, no ports, no screen, just a soft amber LED. Its light beat slow and steady, alive, unseen for years but never dormant. Julianne moved with quiet efficiency, sliding papers toward them. Her notes covered nearly 4 decades, pulse anomalies logged in pencil and ink, long before NOAA systems caught the first electromagnetic rings. The timeline of distortion wasn't random, it was escalating. Each spike in activity corresponded with a shift in recorded history. Sometimes subtle, a radar misinterpretation, a misdated logbook, sometimes profound. She had once tried to warn them. Project Whisper was ignored. She had receded, by choice, not fear. Memory, she had learned, couldn't be trusted in a networked world, but paper remembered. Cassiopeia had been the final active site. That was where they built the divergence array, Emery's mechanism. She hadn't seen him since. His signature lingered only in logs and altered documents. Module X was her answer to his interference, not a weapon, not a time machine, a restoration trigger, a gravitational anchor for causality, not to travel through time, to remind it. She passed Cole the protective case. To Layla, she offered a copy of the last stable convergence map. They turned to leave, but Julianne held them for a moment longer. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, neither hopeful nor resigned, just final. Go now, before the world forgets what it was. Hickam Field, Oahu Territory of Hawaii, December 6, 1941. Early morning. The island exhaled slowly beneath a painted sky. Warm air rolled off the Pacific, softening the pre-dawn light into a hush. Above Hickam Field, the clouds moved in ribbons, slow, shallow, like brushstrokes dragged across a canvas. It was the kind of morning that made war seem very far away. Thomas Langston rose before Reveille. Sleep had come in fragments, his dreams disjointed and colorless. The sensation that woke him hadn't been sound, but pressure, an invisible weight resting just behind his eyes. He sat on the edge of the cot, fingers laced, listening. Nothing unusual, no alarm, no footfalls in the corridor outside. But the stillness was wrong. Hickam Field was never truly silent. Even in its quietest hours, the base pulsed with breath, engines, equipment, footsteps, radios. But this morning, the silence had an edge. Not peace, not calm. The kind of silence that seemed to pull sound inward and hold it there. He dressed without turning on the light, laced his boots by instinct, moved like a man preparing for something he couldn't name. Outside, morning gathered slowly. He stepped into it with caution. From the ridgeline, he could see Pearl Harbor in the distance. The ships anchored there, motionless and immense, cast long shadows across the still water. The sky above them was clear, ordinary, but the feeling in his chest said otherwise. That afternoon, he stood beside a supply truck, clipboard in hand, trying to shake the sense that he had missed something vital. Men laughed nearby, joked, lived as if tomorrow would be the same as today. Thomas wanted to believe that too. But there were moments, brief flashes, when everything around him seemed thinner, less solid, as though the world had been redrawn with lighter ink. At 1500 hours, the base radar registered a transient anomaly, a spectral distortion lasting less than a second, too soft to trigger concern. It was filed as a system error and forgotten by nightfall. Thomas never saw the readout, but at that precise moment, he had paused mid-step, hand tightening around his pen, breath caught in his chest. No sound, no vision, just the faintest whisper of displacement, like the room had blinked and returned. That evening, he wandered the edge of the airstrip. The sun was sinking low, casting a red-gold glow across the tarmac. The buildings stretched long behind him, their windows flickering with routine. He reached the chain-link fence near the western perimeter and looked back toward the harbor. There it was again. Not movement, not light, just a sense. Something above the water, hovering not in space but in memory. A shimmer in the air, a disturbance felt only by the bones. He closed his eyes and saw nothing but the faces of his crewmates, young, ordinary, still here. Then he opened them again, and for a fraction of a second he felt known. Not by God, not by enemy, by something else. And then the moment passed. In 2070, Emery Langston opened his eyes. The convergence interface dimmed around him, its glass cradle still humming. He had felt it. Brief contact. Subconscious recognition. The first time his great-grandfather had responded to the signal. He reached for the logbook, hands shaking. The past hadn't spoken, but it had listened. And tomorrow it might answer. Honolulu and Washington, D.C., present day, 2 days after Oregon. After Oregon, they returned to Hawaii. The NOAA team had begun sweeping for deeper pulse patterns, and Julianne's blueprints needed to be tested against live data. Cassiopeia was still weeks away, and the heart of the anomaly remained where it had always been, hovering quietly over Pearl Harbor. Cole hadn't planned to come back, but the fractures had already begun to show, and neither of them trusted their memory to hold out much longer. The timeline was no longer stable. It wasn't obvious at first, not in the air or the light, but in smaller fractures. Things displaced, things remembered that should not be. People felt them as faint déjà vu, a sudden pause in thought, the uncertain feeling that something had just been said or undone. Cole Sutter noticed it first in his handwriting. Back in his hotel room, he opened his field notebook and found 3 pages filled with dense writing in ink he did not remember laying down. The lines were dated, clear, his own hand, but the contents described conversations with people he hadn't spoken to and references to a paper he never published. At the bottom of one entry was a name that didn't belong there. Emily, age 2, remembers the ships. He stared at the line for a long time, not because it was false, but because it felt real, more real than anything else in the room. He searched his mind for the origin of the memory and found only a void, but in that void there was warmth, laughter, a soft voice calling him Dad, then gone. He closed the notebook gently. He did not open it again for hours. On the other side of the island, Layla stood alone in the upper viewing gallery of the NOAA facility, watching the radar loops fade and repeat across the screen. Her eyes weren't on the data. They were fixed on a name that had just flashed across her phone. Kenji Hara, missed call. She blinked, touched the screen. The log disappeared. Kenji was her brother. At least, she believed he had been. But the details were jumbled now. There were photographs of him in old albums, birthday cards, a drawing she remembered from when they were kids. But there were no digital records, no ID, no health data, no tax file, nothing. As if he had been real once. In a version of her life that had since been folded inward. She opened a desk drawer and found a red thermos inside, a simple object, one she hadn't seen in years. But she knew the dent in the lid, the faded sticker, Kenji's thermos. She did not remember bringing it here. She left it untouched on the desk. Later, Cole and Layla met near the harbor. The sky had turned overcast. Trade winds had dropped. The world felt unanchored, buoyant in a way that suggested it could float free from reality at any moment. They spoke little. There was no need to name what they were feeling. They had begun to fracture. Each bore memories they had not lived. Each felt the pressure of someone else's life pressing inward like a shadow printed under their skin. Time was no longer keeping to its track. It was bending under weight. And somewhere beyond the limits of their perception, the source of that pressure was growing stronger. In the Cassiopeia facility, Emery Langston stood before the divergence array. The convergence field shimmered faintly, like breath on glass. Corella's voice, calm and low, echoed in the chamber. Observer profiles exhibiting cross-temporal contamination, subjective memory bleed increasing, timeline resistance approaching threshold. Emery didn't answer. He was staring into a hollow projection of Thomas Langston, frozen in grayscale, walking the airstrip with his head turned, as if he'd heard something calling from the future. It had worked. The signal had reached him, but the cost was rising. Emery's own reflection wavered in the control surface, flickering between expressions, a smile, a wince, then blankness. He placed one hand on the divergence terminal, and for the first time in weeks he felt unsure, not of the goal, but of who he would be if he reached it.